Hello and welcome to another process explanation video. In this video, we'll be going through each of these four images and talk about how I created them step by step. So a lot of you have found this format quite helpful, as I am also able to kind of touch on more in a spoken format compared to a written format. So hopefully you'll enjoy this video as well and find some of the tips helpful. And without further ado, these were the four images we'll be looking at for this video, and we will begin with this one over here. So to begin with, let's take a look at this image right here. So this is the sketch that I started with. It's actually quite a simple sketch. There's nothing too interesting happening here or any magic sketching techniques being used, but one important thing to take note of is that if we're going to draw a character in a mirror and we kind of want it to look accurate, we have to plan a little bit ahead and then use some of these tools like Perspective Tools 2 to help us line up the perspective grid. And essentially what this allows us to do is to line up, say, the shoulders of the character, right? The elbows and the top of the head according to their actual perspective, and as well as plan for the reflective plane, the mirror itself. So the key thing to take note of is in this sketch stage is that I pay some attention to making sure the perspective lines up. And moving on, in this stage, I actually did a little bit more, which can look like quite a big jump. But basically what actually happened here is not too complicated at all. So if we look at this quick thing that I just drew in an earlier take, is that I lined up the primary light source, which is top down, and of course being primary it is strong and dominant, and a secondary light source which comes in from the side and is much weaker, and that is our red light that we see in the final product. So all that happens in, from the previous stage to this one is that I essentially took into account these two light sources. A good way of doing it would be to darken the entire image and then add in the light source directly, right? Like paint this top down light and then darken everything else, or do the opposite, right? You can darken everything and then add this and then add these highlights. So that is the kind of the main gist. And so as you can also see, I try visualizing what you look like if I have cracks in the mirror, or if the mirror is dark as compared to a normal mirror, as well as this very quick visualization of a use of a selective color layer to essentially visualize what it might look like to have this red light being cast in from the side. Right, and then this is kind of a backup Photoshop file, so let's go to the next one. Right, and here we add in the local colors, and I explained a lot of times before, so we'll keep it a bit brief this time. The idea is to use a soft light layer, or really any layer of your preference. I prefer soft light or overlay because it allows me to essentially fine tune the value and the color at the same time as I paint. So this allows me a bit of finer control and more convenience really as I add the color, because sometimes I might draw the skin tone too bright, so I can lower my soft light layer or my overlay layers value, and I can tune it down a bit as necessary, right? So this is kind of the process that happens here. And as this goes on, right, I also paint a bit organically, and essentially some people ask, well, how do you pick colors, right? To talk about it briefly, right? Initially, I do not care too much about exact hues or exact shades. Once I have the local colors laid in, I basically just use this color picker and sort of kind of blend them kind of organically, right? Paying attention to small things like, okay, we have a bright white light source, so keep the very bright areas kind of bright and desaturated, right? And not too warm. So that's very, very, very basic stuff, right? So once the local colors are added, I can feel a bit more comfortable in painting in more details, as well as adding that red light coming in from the side. Again, here you notice that the image is kind of flipped. That is kind of how the process goes, right? Oftentimes I like to flip the image to make sure I don't miss anything too obvious. Apologies if the pacing is a little bit fast, because I really don't want to drag this on too long, right? So again, here we add in the color, we paint in a bit more details kind of organically. And going from here to here, you notice that I added in this crack in the mirror, right? And a good way to do this is essentially to look up reference. You can simply search something like mirror crack, and then you can just kind of look at how, or rather what are the main characteristics that identify what a cracked mirror looks like, and so on. For example, distorted reflections. In this case, that I actually had tried out but didn't quite work, right? So I decided to keep the reflection somewhat, undistorted, right? As compared to it, if let's say the character's head is like moved to the left, or essentially have this reflection be broken up. So again, right, constant use of references as we paint. So here is really just to kind of think and rethink on the forms to make sure the light goes in the right places, and to maintain the earlier relationship that we established very early on, to have like a main top-down light and to have a secondary side brilliant light. Right, so again, and here is where things get a bit more interesting, because you notice that actually things have changed quite a bit. Right, and so let's kind of take away that extra effects layer and kind of look at these two images and compare them. Right, and you will notice the main thing is that I painted the face of the reflection a bit more carefully to make it look a bit better, even though there are a couple of small errors here and there. Right, because the, excuse me, the bottom layers are hidden. Right. Right, so if we compare this kind of layer here to here, you'll notice that really not much has really happened. And the main thing I would like to take note of is this is kind of where a lot of small details kind of come into play. Because at this stage, if you look at it from far away, right, the image looks serviceable and it looks fine. But so this is kind of where I want to start focusing on the smaller details as well. Right, so where I use very small brushes to kind of paint the hair, right, which is always a convenient place to add detail because of how naturally fine, strands of hair can be. Right, as well as some details in the bracelets, in the little decorations and accessories, and in the rim of the mirror itself. Right, and even have these like micro scratches on the mirror. So this is kind of stage where a lot of small detail goes in, and nothing big changes in terms of the overall composition, because we've achieved something that we like and we want to maintain it. And this will be the final effect, right? From here to here, all I did was to, re-add in the cracks in the mirror that we had used earlier, and then use a selective color layer to kind of tune up this red effect. So for example, let's say we use selective color here, and let's go for red, and then we can tune it up even more. Right, too much looks a bit too ridiculous, or we can tone it down, right? So essentially, selective color is really convenient for this kind of purpose, where you've got everything set up, but you still want to do a bit of tuning. Right, so this is essentially how we got from right here to here. Basically nothing big at all, except for this small tuning to find kind of a color setup that I enjoy. So yeah, that will be it for this particular piece. Again, the main takeaway will be to set up your sketch carefully and add in your main lighting and secondary or tertiary lightings accordingly, right? Interestingly, these are always the very basic stuff that are the most important. I struggle to find too much detail to talk about in these later stages, except to also just essentially make sure you are following steps 1 and 2. And then you can have some fun adding in detail and then playing with colors. So that is sort of it for this piece. So for this next piece is going to be a bit interesting, because this piece was actually made from a sketch that I had done quite a bit ago, right? So this is the final piece, and this is what we begin with. So with this piece, I actually had created this sketch quite a while ago, and essentially had left it to kind of be sitting around because I can't figure out what to do with it. Right, so this is the earliest stage of the sketch. And the basic concept is of course pretty simple. There's again nothing too magical going on here. And in this case, the lighting setup is even simpler than the previous piece. Essentially, the light comes in from on top, and it's sort of a weak, more gentle type of light, you know, on a moody day, on a cloudy day, that kind of effect. So the shadows are darkest where the clothing and the gaps are small, right? Occlusion. And then otherwise, it's really simple. And notice how the shadows aren't too deep or too dark, other than in areas where it's a naturally dark material and it's very occluded. Right, so this is where I essentially picked up this piece. So let's focus on talking about how I essentially painted from this stage to this stage, and you know why I added things like hair and how I added things like you know, these small strands of hair, all these things, right? So I'm kind of covering a different side of the drawing process with this piece. Right, so to begin with, I struggled with kind of figuring out how to include this second character in the shot. So, and I thought about it and like, okay, the composition doesn't really work too well and I want them to interact more if that's how things should be, but that's kind of like a creative struggle in the idea segment of the process, right? So lighting also didn't work well with the second character, so I thought, okay, let's just cut that character out and continue painting with this. Right, so this is sort of the first kind of iteration or paint over job that I did. And let me do a bit of explanation of how to essentially transition from a rough paint to a more polished up style of painting. So again, the idea is quite simple here, right? We have to notice or rather we have to pay attention to our forms, and especially small little things like our brush strokes are actually a bit more important in this particular situation, because we have quite limited colors and essentially values to work with. We have to be a bit more economical about how we add brush strokes, because in an image with lots of details and a lot of small stuff like the previous one, we can afford to be a bit looser, because oftentimes the small brush strokes don't make a big impact on the image itself. But when the image is simpler, especially like this area, this dark area of this jacket, we have to be a bit more precise as we add, or rather we clean up the painting. Right, so as you can see here, we have this couple of rough brush strokes here, right? But they actually look really, really bad if we look at it closely, because they kind of almost represent folds and forms that don't exist at all, right? And we can't get away with it because the whole thing is supposed to be sort of simple. So think about it this way, that it's really easy to disrupt something simple rather than something complex, right? So a couple of small errors can make a simple drawing, or rather a simple area in a drawing, look kind of wrong. Right, so again, as we paint, it's important to pay attention to our forms, pay attention to where we add brush strokes, and as we, you know, aim towards more of a finish, right? Small things like sharp edges to indicate how naturally, you know, the edge of like this particular, the collar, right, of this shirt is going to be sort of sharp as compared to as if we have painted it very roughly, right, like this. Right, the form here will indicate to the viewer that, wait a second, right, this kind of like this looks a bit strange. So of course with these kind of small things, there's a bit of leeway, but this is generally the kind of concept or idea that I go for as I start painting towards completion. Right, as you can see here, I use some mix of brushes, just messing around and experimenting. But the idea is that as we proceed with this stage, right, the main concept is to slowly but surely work your way towards cleaning up unintended errors in the sketch. Right, so for example, this area here is really rough, but some of these, you know, these lines here are wanted, right? For example, we want to retain this here because it indicates the fold in the sleeve. We want some of these folds to remain sort of visible near the edge. So again, right, the cleaning up process is a lot of it is about identifying which areas are excess brush strokes and cleaning them up, and which areas are intended, and so on and so forth, which honestly sometimes I find to be a bit of a challenge because muscle memory takes over and I sometimes accidentally clean up some strokes that I don't intend to. Excuse me. Right, and then as we clean up further, right, some secondary details can also come into play. For example, the sword here was really drawn very roughly. And as we continue painting, we want to give it a more precise form. Same with the hair, right? Previously, the hairband was very rough. Just to kind of help myself visualize what the image will look like in the thumbnail. As you can see here on the right. And this is a continuation of essentially a pretty close continuation of the previous image, right? A lot of work, most of the work here goes into the face. And it's really the same thing as with the previous one. Right, figuring out the exact form of the eyelids, and eye socket itself, how these kind of lines need to be cleaned up, and all these small things. So these are the kind of things that we want to focus on as we paint, right? As I've been about that little mess of brush strokes earlier that I managed to resolve here, right? It's still a bit messy, but right, it's progress, and we're slowly moving towards having image that looks more complete and more serviceable. So normally this will be the part where I decide that the image is fine and it's time to go into painting the small highlights and details. However, there's still a big problem, and this would be the main point I want to talk about regarding this piece and the process. So right now the image looks kind of a bit too quiet, right? Not because an image can't be quiet or it can't be, you know, simple, but the thing is that the entire image is too simple. For example, right, the suit itself being like, okay, it's a suit, it looks sharp and it can look nice, but it's simple in terms of detail, right? Shirt is simple, the tie is simple, right? The glove is a little bit interesting, but it's not that interesting, right? There's a sword, which is cool, but it's not complicated in design. So overall, the image is, I feel at this point in time, a bit too simple, and this is sometimes a problem that you might run into as well. So in these situations, right, normally the response, right, and say if I was to draw a fantasy character, would be to say, okay, let's make the costume more interesting, right? Maybe we can add like a piece of armor here, or we can add like some, you know, leather straps with buckles here, you know, the generic stuff. Generic as it is, they are pretty helpful. But because we are working with this particular kind of setting, it's really not feasible to do so. So in this situation, I would try to find areas where I can add more dynamic movement. So I've noticed that the hair of the character is kind of really stiff, right? It's just like, in terms of direction, it's just doing this. It's basically one stroke with no curves. So this is kind of the direction of the movement of the hair, which is why at this point in time, right, notice that the hair is really, really boring and it's not interesting to look at. Which unfortunately, because the rest of the image is also sort of a quiet type of composition, it makes the piece feel a bit too bland. Right, so this is where I realized that, okay, I need to add some excitement to the piece. And here is where this comes in. So this is the image that is essentially the next step, right? This is what I added and what I painted to help me kind of add more dynamic energy to the piece. Essentially turning the hair from this, right? These very simple C strokes or C brush strokes. I'm not sure the exact terminology, but essentially they're just one curve, right? One simple curve. And then instead extending the length and having, say, the hair and the back wrap around the arm, right? So now this makes things a lot more interesting because we have more compound curves, right? Like this isn't just a C curve, but curves down and then this way. Same with this head and same with the sides, right? It goes like this and it goes like this. And the interesting thing here is that now there's a lot of variation in direction, where previously all the hair would just, you know, just kind of follow this line and essentially end in the same angle. Now we have hair ending up in very different angles, and there's a lot of variation in kind of how these curves overlap each other. right? Like for example, this piece of hair is doing this, another piece of hair is doing this, right? So now we can add a lot of dynamic energy, right? Add a lot more dynamic energy to this particular piece here, thanks to the, well, the use of, right, like this kind of hair movement, I would say, because again, the rest of the image is quiet, so we need something to kind of compensate for it. If we can't add it in terms of, you know, detail and interesting physical objects, we can still try to do so in terms of dynamic movement. Right, so as we clean up the piece and we figure out how exactly to draw the hair in detail, right, as you can see, I've kind of drew in this new variation here, right, same thing. And an important thing to note here is that we want to maintain the direction of movement. Even though it looks very staggered and very messy, we make sure that the curves in general are going in the same direction. They do not have to be aligned, but they have to be going the same direction. Right? That is why, let's say we draw this, right? Let's say we draw strands of hair in the back here, right? Right? These wouldn't work quite well because they'll be indicating your hair is blowing that way. Of course, in the real world, right, wind is complicated, right? It's not just a single it's not just in a single direction. You know, you look at like a wind tunnel test, right? There's really lots of different movement when air hits like an object and it kind of floats around it. But right, in drawing, we kind of want to, at the very least, right, indicate that a dominant direction with our dynamic movement. So in this case, using the compound curves and their overlap and maintaining our dominant direction, we're able to essentially improve the piece, right, from something that's a bit too quiet to something that's more exciting. Right, and now this is the part where, right, we go back to the usual stuff. We go back to looking at a thumbnail, thinking about, okay, so is this image acceptable? If it is time to go and add detail, which is how I kind of wrap up the piece. Right, and with simple stuff like hair, it's really easy to add detail, right? Make sure your big strands are in order. Right, for example, let's say I draw a strand of hair here, but because it gets interrupted by this piece of hair, excuse me. So let's say we are drawing this piece of hair here, right? We want to make sure that we keep this curve intact, right? This piece of hair here, we want to keep the curve intact. Even though, right, it's being interrupted by a hand, it's in, let's use this different color. Even though it's being interrupted by a hand, even though it's being interrupted by another strand of hair, right? We want to keep the curves very intact. So that's kind of one of the things that I look out for as I clean up the hair strands. And then we can also try to pay attention to make sure that the hair strands kind of end properly. For example, as kind of the hair thins out from the source, we have to make sure that they kind of taper off nicely as well. Right, so this is kind of what goes on in this piece. And of course, there's a bit of a final adjustment as I kind of play around the composition. I've decided to move it a bit to the left to have the hair kind of go off screen, right? To kind of, again, right, up the kind of complexity and density of information here. So again, right, we can have our suit remain a suit. It's simple, it's quiet, it's fine, but right, we can essentially compensate by using the hair to add a lot of dynamic energy. Right, same as with here, even the bangs. And basically that is it. And of course, for the very last step, right, very, very fine strokes, kind of wrap things up a bit. And yeah, that is it for this piece. Moving on to the next piece, this one will be quite an interesting one for me to talk about how sketches can begin in a different way. So here we can see the final piece, and here is how it began. So quite simply, the beginning sketch can be very rough, or it can be a bit more precise. In this case, where the small nuances aren't too important and a lot of things that I'm not too familiar with, for example, the car itself, right? I'm not too familiar at drawing with cars. So for my sketch stage, initially, right, the goal really isn't to determine a lot of these things very precisely, but rather mainly to kind of capture the general composition of the scene and how things might look. So this is how I set up the scene, right? Essentially, mainly a character standing on a car in some kind of alleyway or some kind of somewhat outdoor but confined area. So this was the concept behind this piece. And then I tried out the first setup, which is to essentially, which is essentially to have light coming down from above, right? The light source comes down from above, casts shadows on everything. So this particular angle didn't really strike me as very interesting because it just didn't make too much sense, and I wouldn't know how to really develop this angle of like the character on a car in daylight, because they'll kind of imply that, okay, so if it's happening in broad daylight, you know, is it because it's a big commotion, or should there be a lot of onlookers? And that's like, okay, that's not what I want. So the second option is with this particular setup. So in the second option, I had the idea of having a light coming from the side and up, right? So the light source is here and it kind of radiates out from in these directions. So in this case, while the overall setting felt more appropriate because it was kind of dark, it was at night, an issue still remained that a lot of the focus was a bit too strongly directed towards this particular area here for not much of a reason, right? Because why would a character be standing on a car and looking there, right? I couldn't really find a good way to explain that in the drawing, so I tried for another option. So this is the third option that I settled for, which is essentially have the character standing on the car and have like essentially a bright light in the background kind of shine and silhouette the character against the silhouette the character against the background. And then we have like nice little highlights reflecting light off in the foreground. And so I thought this setup was quite interesting, right? So it's already been like 40 minutes, so I'll hurry up a little bit. Right, so with this basic idea, right, I decided to build further upon the scene. And I'll jump forward a bit, but I'll explain what actually happens. So fast forward a bit, we've essentially cleaned up the sketch a little bit and kind of did a bit of thinking on how the scene can be reorganized, right? So we still have the original, essentially the original composition that we decided on, a silhouetted character. But now we added a secondary light, which is this essentially this red light source coming in from the side. Right, so again we have our number one light source, which is this background area here with lots of bright lights, right? And this is kind of its area of influence. And then we have this red light source, which is coming in from the side here and illuminates these areas, and of course the side of the character as well. So this is kind of how things went from there, right? Once we have a basic setup, we want to dig in a bit more and find little improvements in a sense that can help us continue building our image. So this is the kind of decision that I arrived at to essentially cast this red light from the side while maintaining the silhouette that we decided upon earlier. And of course, as we paint, right, we do little things like clean up the character's face, kind of work in the proportions a little bit, and also figure out how to draw a car. So of course, right, with a lot of things like this, reference is always your friend. So for example, I couldn't quite figure out how to position the door of the car or what shape it is. So of course I search out something like old car because that's my intention for this particular piece, and just took a look at the proportions and how things lined up. Right, so this is some very simple stuff. And then moving on, here's where things get a lot sharper. So I'll flip the image back for consistency's sake. So give it a moment because I'm recording now and it's taking up a lot of RAM and all that, so it's going to take a while, right? But basically what's going on is that I've taken the same composition from earlier but started painting more organically, started sharpening the detail. And I would say that it's actually quite important to pay attention to the detail in pieces like this because especially when we have a chance to, right? Like for example, we have a big part of the composition that is how do I put it, non-generic. So what do I mean, right? For example, let's say we draw a forest in the distance or a bunch of mist and clouds, right? In that case, I would say the background is somewhat generic because we can put in very rough details and have the viewer fill in the rest by themselves. But for this situation where we don't really have an excuse to blur out a lot of these background things, it can get a bit tough, right? So we have to paint them, but it's also a chance to showcase cool little details, right? So this is kind of where things went. So a bit of corrugated iron boards below, we have piping, we have windows, we have like a ventilation, right? We have like this little awning. Above, we have like big air ducts, air conditioner units, always convenient to add, right? We can have like these plastic window rims, right? They add a interesting, touch of bright values to this dark area. Signboards, dumpsters, all these little things are good stuff to add into areas, or rather to put it in another sense, right? It's important to have details like these in areas that you can't avoid drawing in detail. Right, same with the car, we also want to kind of up the density of detail in the car, right? Have these little lines that exist in real life in some models of car, or at least in my reference image of the car, right? So small little things like these go a long way to help the image feel more complete. So moving on from this, right? So essentially this is almost done. A lot of the key areas have been touched up, and the composition again, right, is still intact. So you will notice that in terms of big changes, there really aren't any more that will be happening, right? Because we've locked in this composition quite early on through a kind of a dynamic sketch stage where we took a little bit of time to kind of figure out what kind of variation in lighting we want. Right, again, let's take a look at that. Right, again, let's take a look at this, right? So with very rough strokes and within like a short couple of minutes, I was able to essentially plan things out, and then we stuck with it all the way until here. And then moving forward, basically it's pretty much the same concept, right? Continuing on where we left off, we just, again, with the trick that I show off in the very first video, right? Tilting the reds, for example. Let's say now that I'm looking back at it again, I felt that the reds are a bit too strong. So we can always, right, tune them down or tune them out as we previously have. Right, so essentially that is the main gist of the main teaching point of, I guess, of this piece. However, you can also start with dynamic sketches. You don't have to be fixed in with your lighting options. Try out a dynamic sketch. If you like it, stick with it, and then pay attention to areas of detail that you can't avoid, right? And the penalty for avoiding them is to have an image that looks incomplete, right? So this is the kind of thing that I myself sort of realized I painted this. And yeah, that will be it for this particular piece. Last but not least, let's talk about this final piece here. Now, in terms of concept, it's really simple. It's basically kind of like a continuation of the previous piece where we just have like a zoomed in shot of the character adjusting gloves. So conceptually, it's pretty simple, but I think in terms of the process in which this piece is made, I think there are a couple of interesting things I want to talk about. So to begin with, I actually had this sketch lying around here that I haven't had a chance to really finish. I kind of lost like the motivation to finish it, or rather it just felt like I didn't have quite the right idea about how to figure this piece out. So instead I decided, okay, the pose is quite solid, so let's see how we can make use of that, right? So making use of this pose here, I did a bit of fiddling around, as you can see here, I cross-referenced back to our previous piece to see how things can be played around with and adjusted. Right, and then came up with something like this. Right, some pretty simple stuff. Essentially following the lighting guide from here, right? Essentially following the same lighting from here, but drawing it up close. So that is kind of the simple part of this and the straightforward part of the explanation. And of course, we just go along and we go ahead and we keep going along. It's just same as before. We make small adjustments. We continue painting. We make, more adjustments as we move along. Little details, right? Adjusting the darkness of the background to make it feel more, claustrophobic because it was feeling too open. And as we saw from the previous scene, this was kind of a dark alleyway and all that kind of good stuff. So essentially we're trying to maintain the focus of the scene, right? And then we continue here, we add more detail, we add little folds into the gloves, and all these are stuff that we've gone through before. So I wouldn't say this is the interesting part of the piece, right? I'll say that here I actually picked up a couple of learning points, which I hope to share with you guys. So again, right, these process steps aren't strictly step by step, do this and do that, but really I think it's a good chance for me to share a couple of learning points that I actually found out for myself. So if we go back to this image here, right, one thing we'll notice about this particular or quote-unquote original sketch is that I feel I did the lighting setup better here, right? Because the light came in at an angle and that allowed for surfaces on the character to pick up more rather substantial amounts of surfaces on the character's body to pick up that light source reflected at us. So essentially the light source, a big light source, right, the main light source, is represented well by reflective surfaces or reflecting surfaces on the character's body. So I would say a strength of this original sketch is that the main light source is represented in these strong highlights, right? While the supporting light from here is, of course, represented as well. So that is one of the strengths that I kind of regret losing in this piece, because with this setup, I still tried a little bit to add these things in, but I always never felt quite perfectly right. Right, because when a light comes in directly from behind and you're at this angle, it's tough to have surfaces to kind of essentially capture and reflect the light very, very decisively as with before. So yeah, I would say I'm not too happy with this piece, and I kind of think that I could do better by maybe, let's say, essentially following this setup closer and rotate the character such that the immediate backdrop is not like a very simple silhouette, but kind of involve the background a bit more. And all these kind of things are, interestingly, I feel they're part of the process, because drawing is not always straightforward. In fact, I think it's never straightforward. A lot of times there's stuff like this they just think about and then you regret, and then you're like, okay, we'll try again next time, right? So I guess the learning point from this piece is always be flexible and think about your, how do I put it? Don't think too hard on following very strict rules when you're drawing, right? For example, if you're drawing continuation from a previous scene, don't think or follow things a bit too rigidly, right? Try to be a bit more flexible, think about how the image could be more interesting, and in a sense, right, I almost say be somewhat mentally prepared, right, to essentially not create something that create something that isn't essentially what you wanted exactly. So I would say this is also part of the drawing process. Be prepared for kind of things, little things like setbacks, and sometimes you feel like you didn't do your best. So yeah, these are the 4 pieces for this month. And again, as I keep saying, right, like, don't worry about things too much. There's always the next piece. There's always learning experience, and there's always a lot of accumulation and a lot of build-up that goes into slowly improving each and each and every one of our own skills. So again, I'm glad to have done this piece, even though there are places that things could have been better. But again, right, just want to kind of share that this is part of my process as well. Right, and every time we draw something, we learn a bit more, and so on and so forth. And here's take a look again at these 4 pieces for this month. Regrettably, I wasn't able to put out a bit more, as this set kind of got bogged down a little bit towards the end, but that means we'll probably have a bit more for next month. So anyway, of course, sometimes certain images you will like more than others. Sometimes you'll feel like your effort paid off more than other times. So I just want to remind everyone again, this is all part of the painting process, and I hope that what I've shared with you in this video is helpful and is somewhat explanatory of my drawing process. Thank you again, and I hope to see you, in fact, a little bit later for this month's tutorial video.